The history of modern British poetry is often misread as a steady, linear march toward artistic liberation, an unbroken path leading away from Victorian constraints directly into the open plains of free verse. The actual record shows a more volatile dialectic. From the 1890s through the 1960s, each decade engineered a specific formal reaction, a precise counter-movement to the established poetic idiom of the era preceding it. This analysis focuses on the high modernist mode of the 1920s, a system designed to weaponize fragmentation and break the traditional mechanics of reading. High modernism represented the apex of avant-garde formal achievement, yet the very next generation of poets moved to dismantle its core structures only a decade later. Understanding this requires tracking how writers transformed the poem from a medium of personal expression into a structural mechanism of discontinuous composition. At the close of the 19th century, poets began rejecting the conventionally smooth, bejeweled diction of the Victorian era. Thomas Hardy pioneered this shift, adopting an ironic mode that presented poetry as a series of unadjusted impressions of a raw and disturbing reality. Gerard Manley Hopkins introduced the first major structural innovation with a technique he called sprung rhythm. While traditional meter relies on symmetrical waves of alternating beats, Hopkins fixed the number of stressed syllables and allowed the unstressed syllables to shift and crowd around them, locking the primary rhythm into place like a structural beam. This jagged, uneven rhythm revived the metaphysical mode. It provided a framework to yoke violently opposed ideas together, forcing a collision between concepts like secular and divine love through sheer technical force. This shift moved the poem's value toward a documentation of the psychological process of creation, mapping the internal workings of the poet's mind rather than providing an autobiographical narrative. Hopkins's mimetic representation of discord established the formal precedent for the impersonality that came to define modernism. Leading up to World War I, this evolution moved toward hard precision, unadorned economy, and clinical self-observation. The 1913 Imagist Manifesto formalized this drive. It mandated the scrupulous elimination of any word, particularly adjectives, that did not directly contribute to the presentation of the object. The result was a non-mimetic image, a form produced by emotional energy and arranged like overlapping planes in a sculpture, functioning without the need for narrative transitions. The orderly, traditional forms of the past proved entirely insufficient for the external catalyst of the 1910s, the unprecedented trauma of World War I. War poets used realistic detail and unsettling juxtaposition to shock readers, using the common soldier's perspective to expose the reality of dehumanized violence. The combination of Imagist economy and wartime trauma ended the viability of polite, liberal humanism in verse, clearing the ground for radical high modernism. This formal engineering reached its peak in the 1920s under the high modernist mode championed by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Their central architectural technique was discontinuous composition. This method functions by stripping out all links of smooth transition, forcing radically disconnected images and fragments to sit side by side without syntactical explanation. Coherence is maintained through a principle from contemporary Gestalt psychology. A random collection of marks on a page eventually reveals a harmonious pattern to the observer, who naturally seeks design in the fragments. In Eliot's work, a heap of broken images achieves coherence through an underlying musical structure of relationships. Because there is no transitional syntax to guide the reader, the brain must bridge the gaps to form an open gestalt. This fragmented form provided a mathematically faithful mirror to the rootless, heterogeneous, cosmopolitan culture of the modern megalopolis. The disjointed architecture of the wasteland functions as a mastery of fragmentation, precisely engineered to reflect a disintegrating European civilization. Almost immediately after high modernism achieved this formal peak, the next generation of poets turned entirely against it. The 1930s introduced economic depression and the rise of fascism, creating a material reality demanding a shift from literary tradition into social and political commitment. While Eliot and Yeats remained politically conservative and distrustful of democratic tendencies, a new circle emerged, led by W.H. Auden. Auden, who prioritized anti-fascist urgency and Marxist sympathy. The 30s poets found that the esoteric allusions and fractured syntax of the 1920s could not bridge the gap to a mass audience in crisis. To engage with current socio-political issues, they required a more intelligible idiom. This forced a formal reversal. Poetry moved back toward traditional syntax, native English speech, and classical meters like the sonnet to serve the need for immediate legibility. When civilization faces an external threat that demands collective action, poetry often sacrifices avant-garde experimentation in favor of political clarity. The pendulum swung again in the 1940s as a new generation reacted against social reporting, embracing the mysterious and subconscious neo-romanticism of the New Apocalypse movement. By the 1960s, British poetry branched further, absorbing the freewheeling verse of the American beat movement alongside deeply confessional styles. The timeline now displays the full decadal pendulum of British poetry. This evolution moves within a constant tension between the psychological interior and the urgent political exterior. When civilization feels fragmented but introspective, syntax fractures into gestalts. When civilization faces collective external threats, syntax solidifies to communicate. The map of modern British poetry remains a technical record of writers continuously redesigning the architecture of language to survive the shifting pressures of the 20th century.